Hey everyone, JTG Josh the Gamer back with another EverQuest video. This is a video that I actually started making over a year ago, but then I got sidetracked. You see, I was trying to come up with the video ideas and settled on making a top 10 list of my favorite EQ zones, pre-Shadows of Luclin. Why pre-Luclin? Well, because EQ just has way too many zones, and the only way I could narrow it down to 10 was to split it up into chunks. And Classic EQ, Knark, and Velios has some very awesome zones that deserve a bit of attention. So why didn't I make this video a year ago? Well, let's get to number 10 on my list and I'll explain it there. Number 10. Kyosaur Forest. So I started making this list and this was the zone that I had sitting at number 10. I thought I might need to explain why it was there on the list, so I started writing out the story of the zone. That's when it hit me that Kyosaur Forest deserved a video of its own. So I made one. And people seemed to like it. So I made more and never really got back to making my top 10 zones video. So I'm not going to get into the whole story of Kyosaur in this little list, but basically it's a zone that doesn't really look like much on the surface, but it has some really great lore that I think about every time I have to cross it. Number 9. Keel Drael. When the Scars of Velios expansion came out, the scale of it had me in awe. Everything was just so huge. The half-hour boat ride and then 20-minute run across Iskalad hammers home the scope of the expansion. And as you reach the far side of Iskalad, you start seeing the giants patrolling. When you find the city of Keel Drael, its entrance may not look like anything special, but once you're inside, it's just huge. Dungeons in Classic and Knark were always tight and cramped. The cavernous city of the giants was something completely different. Combine the scope of the zone with challenging raid fights like King Thomas and the Avatar of War makes this a memorable zone that will always live in my memories. Number 8. Sulase B. Hidden deep in the Lava Storm Mountains just outside of the Nectalis Forest lies Sulase B, home of Lord Nagafin. The zone itself may not be anything special, cramped, winding tunnels filled with kobolds, spiders, lava monsters, bats, and eventually fire giants. But what really makes this zone memorable and one of my favorites was the fact that for me, just like many other players who played in the early days of EQ, Nagafin was my first raiding experience. Waves of players throwing themselves at a huge fire-breathing dragon is amazing, and you never really forget your first time. Number 7. Keyage Keep. This zone makes the list purely based on how unique it was. I used to avoid this zone at all costs back when I first started playing. I was bad enough at swimming at all, let alone when it was the entire zone and in 3 dimensions. But years later, when I finally got up the courage to explore this place, I discovered that it's actually one of the coolest zones in the original game map. What other zones can you fight fish, sharks, mermaids, seahorses, and of course the big bad boss of the end of the zone, Phineas Atropus, all while trying not to drown or get lost in the 3-dimensional maze that is this zone. Number 6. Vlecators Labyrinth. Anyone who's leveled in Velios era has probably spent more than their fair share of time in Vlecators Labyrinth. Much like Keyage Keep, it has an unusual 3-dimensional aspect to the map with its maze of frozen ramps filled with spiders leading up to the rest of the zone. Its 2 kobold camps, Upper Dogs and Lower Dogs, led me to repeatedly make my favorite lame joke while leveling near multiboxing. I would call it a camp check on one of my accounts, and then on another I would call out Up Dog instead of Upper Dogs and wait. No one usually bid on the joke though, so on the 3rd account I would ask, "What's up, dog?" And then on the account that I called out the camp, I would respond, "Not much, what's up with you?" And then I would laugh for a bit. And then I'd do a /who on the zone to see how many people's days I brightened with that gem, and I'd realize that I was alone in the zone because it's a couple-year-old TLP server and no one levels in Vlecators anymore. The zone is also home to one of the longest named NPCs in the game, Lord Diljani Viitamita Vegemin, and the great sorcerer himself, Vlecators. Number 5. The Crypt of Dylnar. This is another zone that deserves a lore deep dive of its own. It has an awesome multi-level setup where once you drop down to the lower levels, there's no way out aside from teleporting or fighting your way to the exit. Fighting here actually had some real risk. Dropping down that first well into a room full of goos and clee could be terrifying. The zone was also very well made. It wasn't barren like some of the Knark-era zones, like Mines of Nurga, for example, and there were mobs everywhere. And to top it all off, the Clee Overseer at the end of the dungeon would straight up charm you and make you just stand beside him and live as his pet, pretty much indefinitely, until someone came and rescued you, or you were lucky enough to resist his allure. I still love going to this zone to this day. Number 4. Canine's Castle. This might be a bit of an unpopular opinion, but I've always liked Canine's Castle. Sure, it's almost all just Dorvalg and undead, but I always feel like there must be a cool story behind the place. As a cleric, I like to sit in the zone and drift off imagining what that story might be, only to be pulled back by the screams of my group, desperate for heals, as they fought off a massive passing train that the bard had aggroed onto us with one of their AoE songs. I did eventually learn the story behind the zone, and it's every bit as cool as I imagined. I talk about it in my Runes of Knark lore videos. This zone also had one of the coolest bosses in the zone, Varnil Satyr. Number 3. Seibelis. Is there anything cool or special about a Frogluck? Not really. They just kind of hop around and act like a bit of a nuisance. Is there anything cool or special about hundreds of Froglucks crammed into a sweet underground dungeon? Heck yeah, there is. Seibelis was so much fun back in the old days of the Knark expansion. After I would finally get a group and then die on my way to the camp and then get dragged to the camp and then get rezzed by the cleric, but only the 10% res, not the 90% res because he had to conserve mana, I loved hanging out for hours killing frog after frog. I would wonder why all of these frogs were living in this stone dungeon and not in the swamps of Knark, or why they seemed to be protecting Terracannon, the undead dragon, or why I could never seem to get invited to a Fungi King group or a Giganauts group. But none of that mattered because this zone was a lot of fun. Number 2. Najena. When I first started playing EverQuest, I was obsessed with playing Dark Elves. I tried some of the other races, but one of my favorite aspects of the game was being able to see what's going on around me, so the race with innate ultravision seemed like the obvious choice to me. This means that the closest dungeon to my starting location in Nyctelis Forest was Najena. This place fascinated me. I would slowly explore the dungeon over the course of months, clearing an area and then reaching a point where I couldn't progress anymore, so I would leave and go level and then come back and clear farther, until finally around the start of Knark, I finally explored the whole place. I didn't have any friends and was too socially awkward to make or join a group at this point, so I had to do it all solo, and as a Dark Elf warrior. I learned every spawn point, every trap, every cool piece of loot in Najena. It was my favorite hangout. Number 1. Guck. Sorry for pronouncing this one wrong. I'm pretty sure it's supposed to be pronounced Guck, but I had to re-record this part of the video because apparently that's a bad word. I guess the EverQuest developers didn't realize that or something. Anyways, Guck. So, like I asked earlier, is there anything cool about hundreds of Froglucks crammed into a sweet underground dungeon? Heck yeah, there is. And is there anything you could possibly do to make that any cooler? What's that? Make half of them undead? Awesome. This is the classic EverQuest dungeon crawl zone. Iconic camps like the Frenzied Ghoul or the Ghoul Lord, and every monk's favorite 20+ hour camp, Raester. And if you really want to, you can enter this zone with friends, for those of you that have them, at level 1 and not leave until you hit 50. I don't even want to know how many hundreds of hours I must have spent killing Froglucks in this zone over the years. Probably enough that if I had spent that time focusing on my education or learning useful skills, I could probably have done something worthwhile with my life.